Hello, and welcome to the Hypno Travelers on the Magical Psyche Highway podcast. That's right. Your host and tour guide is Scott Prevett, a healer, hypnotist, and a magician. And your bus driver is Jason Gobelli, also a hypnotist, an entrepreneur, and a spiritual guide. Disclaimer, neither Jason, Scott, or any of our guests here today are licensed professional psychologists or psychiatrists. So please don't make any changes to any medication or treatments that you are currently on based on the conversations that you hear here today. Just hop on the bus and enjoy the ride. Trip with us on the Inner Revelation bus. That's right.
Hey, welcome to the Hypno Travelers on the Magical Psyche Highway. We're excited today because we've got a wonderful guest. We got Timothy September. Ain't that right, Scott?
Welcome.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me.
You?
Yeah, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, we're so glad to have you. So let's start and let's get right on it right away. So, big question for you is, who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name's Timothy September. I am the head of coaching with Mike Mandel Hypnosis, and also I am co-founder of Picthos, which the CEO Chris Thompson and I started as a way to help hypnotists run their business and get themselves up and running. And I also have my own approach to conversational hypnosis and calibration, and it's called Enter the Loop.
Nice. So Tell us a little bit about this Enter the Loop. What the hell is that?
Yeah, so Enter the Loop, it's essentially taking on the premise that all of us have some type of loop. Typically, there's like two types of loops I like to think of primarily, which is the intrapersonal loop, which is the me to another person, and then the intrapersonal loop, which is self to self. And in hypnosis, and you guys know this because we're hypnotists, Mike, Mandel, he's always talking about the concept of the psychodynamic loop, which is that ebb and flow between the hypnotist and the subject. And that's why we calibrate. We're looking for things that typically go unnoticed, like the external trance indicators. And those could be, the slowing down of their speech to, their eyelids fluttering, or hypnotic mask when they're starting to go into trance. But I started to look at the way that Milton H. Erickson and Ernest Rossi would often ask questions while their their subjects were in trance, the way that people like Melissa Tiers, she works directly in their psychodynamic loop, in their space, which I thought was really interesting. And then you have people like James Tripp, who he has hypnosis without trance. And it's all about this loop that he's figured out where the subject is believing something, they're imagining it, there's a physiological response, and then they have the experience, which feeds back into the belief. And so I started taking all of the learnings that I had from all these people, because I've either read their books front to back, I can't tell you how many times, or I've taken their training, like Richard Hill's Mirroring Hands is another great example. So I started taking all these frameworks, and I realized, like, I asked myself the question one day, I was doing the dishes. This is literally what happened. I was doing the dishes, and I found myself zoning out. I'm sure we've all had that experience. Highway hypnosis is another great example. We just zone out, and suddenly we arrive at our destination. Like, what the heck just happened? And I realized while I was doing the dishes, I'm like, well, wait a minute. I was in trance. I just finished the dishes. What was going on with me? What were my external trance indicators? Like, if you were watching me from the outside, what would that look like? So I started calibrating people, not just in everyday, hypnosis, where the hypnotist is doing something and vice versa. But instead it was, well, I'm noticing these things happening during conversation too. It's not just during hypnosis. Like, what is that? Because Milton H. Erickson and Ernest Rossi and all these like big figures, even Dave Ellman, talk about waking hypnosis. They talk about this idea that hypnosis is happening all the time. And so I was like, well, how in the world would I spot that? How would I notice that unless I was looking for it? Right. That's where Mike, he gets from his mentor, Derek Ballmer, you can't see what you can't see. And then Mike typically says, oh, well, that's like a tautology, saying that all doctors are doctors, or all lawyers are lawyers. But in reality, what that means is that you can't see or notice what you're not looking for. And so I started just every day conversations, I started noticing people going in and out of trance when I was doing like the Nuvi language thing that Mike, and Chris teach, just talking about stories, metaphors, like just watching people go in and out of state. And so I took a class with Melissa Tiers, and I watched her do this as well. And I was like, this is so fascinating, but nobody's looking at it from this perspective. They're just looking at it like, oh, well, this is just everyday conversation. So I started doing it. I like my personal clients, I just, during the intake part, instead of me trying to solve their problem at the end where I figure out what they need and what they want, and then we do the quote unquote hypnosis, and then I hope that it works. That was always the big kicker for me, because if any of you have ever had any experience coaching or doing hypnosis or even just traditional therapy, we typically rely on either the script or the technique to kind of be the thing that solves the problem. But when it doesn't work, it's like, well, I threw everything at it. Now what? So instead of me placing all of my eggs in the basket on, I hope this technique works, instead I said, well, what if I maybe tried fixing it during the intake? Just asking questions a certain way, because we already know, like with meta model and clean language questions, we know that can create some profound shifts in people. But what if I start asking questions in a different way? And the different way in this, I guess, circumstance situation when you're doing one-on-one work is, we already know, and I got this information from Stephen Walensky. He wrote a book called Trances People Live, and he describes how everyday deep trance hypnotic phenomena, like we're talking, typically when someone's in a somnambulistic trance, we expect them to produce, maybe spontaneous catalepsy or spontaneous age regression or all these other quote unquote deep trance phenomena. But then people like James Tripp are getting it, and people are like talking to him. You have people like Melissa Tiers who are able to do it through conversation. And I was like, there's got to be something there. So when Stephen Walensky starts talking about the everyday trance, he references, Milton H. Erickson and Ernest Rossi using like Nuvi language, like nominalizations and metaphors. And I realized with clean language, David Grove, and when he was figuring out people's metaphors, how you could just ask questions and get them to expound upon it, and that helped. I was like, well, why don't I ask questions about those things? So that's where it started. It was hearing people use their nominalizations and their metaphors, and instead of just letting it go and saying, okay, yeah, sure, but what else do you want in life? I asked them about the nominalization. So a client might say something like, well, I just don't feel like I have the power to, stand up to my boss. And instead of me saying, well, now imagine that you do have the power, and what does it look like? That's not helpful. I'm not helping them. I'm just telling them to imagine the future of their life when it's not there. But the reality is they're in a container of the problem. If they could have solved it, they wouldn't have came to see me. So instead I would ask them, well, like, tell me more about power. And they might say, oh, well, I don't know. I'm, power. It's like, and then suddenly they're talking about a story that almost seems like it has nothing to do with the original problem. And most people are trained to ignore it. They go, oh, well, that's just like a side thing. Like, I'm not even going to listen to it. But I realized that that's actually something I would call a resource. Their unconscious mind brought to the forefront something that it in some way, shape, or form is related to it. Milton H. Erickson and Ernest Rossi, in several of their books like Hypnotic Realities, they describe this too, how you can relate things that maybe don't seem like they're connected, but it creates trance. So that's why Milton H. Erickson, he would ask two questions in a single question. And it would be something like, what does it feel like knowing you're already in trance to find out that you're going deeper? So it's like two separate questions, but it still creates this like open feedback loop, right? So I would start asking questions about the second story that the client would give me. So maybe it was power. And now they start bringing up, well, oh, I don't know, when I was 3 years old, my dad, did this, or my mom said this, or blah, blah, blah. So then I would ask what that thing had to do with the original problem, because they almost seem unrelated. So I would mash them together. I would, basically, put them together just through a simple question. And I would watch people go into trance. I would watch them do derivational searches. I would watch them do hypnotic mask, the whole shebang. And I started realizing, I call them conversational trance indicators. I started realizing that we all do this, even just in everyday conversation. So buddy's talking to you and he's, talking about, oh yeah, I went fishing the other day and blah, blah. And you're like, whoa, okay. So, tell me more about that. And, oh yeah, I like fishing. It helps me relax. You say, oh, cool. Like what kind of relaxing, is that? And, oh, I don't know. And then now he's talking about, how he's at work and he just wishes that he could do that. And it's like, well, why did he bring this story up? It has nothing to do with fishing. But if you mash them together, his unconscious mind is going to start delivering him stuff that he didn't even know absolutely like that was possible. And in this case, that's where the resource actually starts becoming the thing that we didn't even realize was there. So I started noticing these conversational trance indicators happen. And as all of us would, Milton H. Erickson talks about how if you ask them about the trance that they experienced, they go back into trance. And we know that, under Weissenhofer, in 1957, he described Vogel's fractionation, which is if you get somebody to go into trance, pull them out, put them back in, they go deeper. Dave Ellman figured this out when he asked, well, why am I waiting, a whole week for them to come back? Why can't I do that in an hour? Why can't I do that, in 5 minutes? Why can't I do that immediately? Which is where we got the eye, open and close fractionation from Dave Ellman. So I started realizing that this happens with questions too. So I might notice that conversational trance indicators happen, and I would ask a question about that. Like, oh, I noticed when you answered that, your eyes stopped blinking. Does that normally happen? Now they're going inside, trance is happening, and I've now fractionated them. So this is the idea of like the self-to-self loop. So you can start noticing these things in everyday conversation with people, just asking them questions about what their experience is in the moment. And then you can dive deeper into it by asking them things like on James Tripp's, his wheel, his hypnosis without trance wheel, like what do they really believe about the problem? Because now you're getting their internal representation of the problem, which might be a metaphor, it might be a story, it might be something, and they're imagining it. So we know that they're going into trance. They're already in trance. So there's all these loops happening to bring this all back. There's all these loops happening that go almost unnoticed. And it's up to us as hypnotists to see them, because if not, we're literally missing everything. I stopped taking notes 100%. I don't take notes at all, because taking notes requires me to look away from my client. And if they're telling me a story and I see them going into trance, I want to know that, okay, I'm getting somewhere. They're not just giving me some off the cuff BS. They're actually going into hypnosis in order to, find these things, because the unconscious mind, it's always communicating, and it's up to us to notice it. So by calibrating, which is always watching your client, it gives you a higher probability of solving their problem at the very beginning of the session, meaning that I don't have to rely on techniques. I don't have to rely on scripts. I don't have to rely on any of that stuff. I just ask better questions about the things that put them in hypnosis already. And as long as you keep them in trance, as long as you keep them in their little trance bubble, they'll solve their own problem, because the client is the one ultimately that has the solution anyways. It's not up to us. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. So let me say, so this is a program, correct? Is this a program that you teach?
Yeah.
So have you written a book?
I'm actually in the process right now of writing a book. It's an online course. It's a 12-week self-guided course that teaches the advanced conversational, all the things in conversational hypnosis that are not typically taught. Like, I don't focus on language patterns. I don't focus on special words or anything, but I teach concepts and principles and frameworks that you can use in everyday conversation, that you can use without thinking that it's hypnosis. Coaches can use it. Therapists can use it. Hypnotists, they have a one up on those, because they already are coming into it with the framework of knowing that hypnosis is happening all the time. And the 12-week program, it's laid out week by week, and the focus is all on an activity. Here's what we're going to do. Everyone go practice it. And it's self-guided. So there's a community and everything, bunch of students in there. They love to practice. And I also include every couple of times during a month, we do live group coaching calls. So I do live demonstrations where I show it, and I've helped people overcome sleep. And the problem was never the problem, right? The presenting problem is typically never the presenting problem. So I've helped people on the calls resolve sleep, get rid of pain, fix their marriage, their relationships, overcome trauma, just through question asking and figuring out where their loop is, and then keeping them in that trance of the loop until it resolves, because we all want closure in some way, shape, or form. That's the whole point. So I like to imagine it like metaphorically speaking, all of us have this. If you're on the internet and on the computer, we all experience this where our browser has a million tabs open. And if we open up one more tab, everything crashes. Most of us live life like that. We just have a bunch of tabs open. And these are all those open loops of our life that we haven't closed yet. And so anything else that we attempt to add on to that, it just feels daunting. That's why we procrastinate. That's why we feel fatigue. That's why we, even if we wanted to do the thing, it's like, I can't find it in myself to do it. But whenever somebody's loops close, we've all experienced this, with a client that's had a really great session. They'd say, oh my gosh, I feel lighter. I feel like I've got more energy. I feel better. That's what you're doing, is you're helping them get rid of those tabs so they have more resources to be able to do what they want to do. And you can do this in conversation, just asking questions. There's no language patterns, no nothing that you have to worry about.
Nice. So that's pretty cool. So are you telling me that my brain has too many tabs open?
Yeah, I think all of us have too many tabs open. I do, I have it too. All of us do. It's just part of the human condition. That's what that's why we're here. Our brain's really good at it though. There's a couple of loops that I discussed, like one's called the Zeigarnik loop, which Bluma Zeigarnik, she was a Russian psychologist. She was actually like Lithuanian, Russian, but she discovered that she was out at lunch and she realized that one of the servers that she was observing was able to remember the entire table's order until the check closed. And then as soon as the check closed, they couldn't even remember like who was sitting where, who ordered what. So she started doing experiments on this. And we know that as the Zeigarnik loop. And that's where when a loop is open or a tab is open, it'll persist until it closes. Now, she had a colleague, Maria Ovianskin. Geez, it's such a hard last name. Ovianskin, Jesus. Okay. Either way, there's another loop. Ovianskina. There it is. It's called the Ovianskina loop. It's Maria Ovianskina. She was actually a colleague with Bluma, and she realized that the times where we procrastinate and the times when we ignore whatever the problem is, the more that we get interrupted when our loop is open, and the more that we ignore the loop, it actually creates mental fatigue. That's where we get the brain fog. That's where we get the feeling of procrastination and not wanting to do it. So every time, and at first it's like, okay, like one or two times of ignoring it, that's nothing. But when it starts persisting, and people have this throughout their whole life, years and years and years, that's why people start becoming addicted to things. That's why they start gambling, and because they don't want to actually address the issue because they don't know how. So instead they ignore it. But every time they do, it gets worse and worse and worse for them. So by closing the loop, the persisting loop, people gain resources back. They feel like they can feel better. And so in my research, when I realized like, oh gosh, okay, I think there's something here. And you start closing people's loops or helping them find resolution to their problems, they gain those resources back. They gain the ability to start thinking about things again. And I can finally, I finally have the mental energy to go start working out or do this other thing. But I think the problem that a lot of hypnotists run into is that we get fixated around, okay, well, this person came in with a sleep issue. So therefore, I'm just going to do a technique that helps them overcome their sleep issue. And I can't tell you how many times it's never that. Like on one of my group calls, one of my students, clients, whatever, one of my students was having a sleep issue. And when we dug into it, it actually wasn't sleep. They didn't like where they lived, but they were too afraid to do it, which is so weird because you're like, well, what does that have to do with anything? So just by asking questions and digging into it in about 30 minutes, we got to the real issue, kept them in the loop, it resolved. So a week later, they're now sleeping again. Their fitness is on point. They're waking up at a good time. They started making the decisions that they needed to move. And I just heard from them last week, and this was like a month or so ago when this happened. Last week, they've already started looking at apartments in another country. That's how quickly this can fix people, because it's not up to us. If I would have just focused on, okay, let's do a technique that helps you get better at sleeping, it might help for a little bit, but the real problem would have still been there, because the loop that she had open wasn't sleep. That was the symptom. And so this is where we get into the law of paradoxical change, which is the symptom is the cure. The sleep was the symptom. The cure to it, though, was that she wanted to move. So instead of using okay, well, I'm just going to help her get better sleep, instead, I used the sleep issue to bridge over to the real problem. So by asking her questions around the sleep, it started opening up other resources. Like she was telling me stories from when she was a child, to suddenly now it's bridged into, well, she's giving me nominalizations. And she was using phrases that only the unconscious mind would have given, because they were the same. No matter how many stories, no matter the different ways that she was describing her issue, she kept using one of the same phrases, which was go back to. Like, oh, I just want to go back to this. I want to go back to that. I want to go, no matter what. So when I realized, okay, tell me about going back. What is that? Suddenly she's like age regressed back to when she was a child, and she wants to be with her mother again in Colombia. And she's like, I don't speak the language of the country I'm in right now. Nobody understands me. I feel so alone. And that's what was keeping her up at night. It wasn't that she had bad sleep. It was that she just felt so alone. And so by digging into that, and by now getting her nominalizations, her unspecified verbs, asking questions around that, seeing her go into trance, asking her about the trance she's in, suddenly now she's having all these realizations. She's coming up with her own epiphanies. And that's how it should really be. That's a breakthrough. When we think about the idea of like our clients having a breakthrough, that's what's happening. They are having an epiphany. Something in their unconscious mind is presenting them the idea to the conscious, and they go, I never thought of that before. And I've now helped them bridge the two together. And that in of itself will close the loop. So by closing the loop, she now has more energy to finally do the things she wants to. And she stopped procrastinating. She started getting better sleep. Her health is improved. She hasn't had back issues. Like all these things that she didn't think were related were all fixed from one conversation. And we all have the power to do it. I'm just some dude. I'm just some guy that just kind of like threw some stuff together. It's not like I'm a magical person. We can all do this.
Yes, but that was so artfully done.
Sure.
So now that we say that, I got one for you. So you talked about them doing it at the restaurant. So do you do that? Enter them in a loop when you're at the restaurant and placing your order, huh?
Yeah, I think, like I said, we can all do this. I've helped people in 4 questions in 3 minutes. Like I was just on a guest call. You guys know who Ryan Montes is, right? He's Ryan Montes, man. He's awesome. He's where I got the certification for me to get my board certification through the American Board of Hypnotherapy. He trained under Tad James's style of hypnosis, and he's an awesome trainer. Right now, he does the mission and movement. He's got this it's for social media and helping people to be able to build their business up, but on like the social media side of things. And I was a guest trainer on, not really a trainer, I was like one of his guest speakers, I guess you could say, just last week. And I entered the loop with like 11 people. And in one of those people, it was literally like a 3-minute intervention. They had a massive breakthrough, something they've been dealing with for months. And I asked a couple questions, and suddenly they had a breakthrough immediately. And they were like, they're like, that's it. I never would have thought of that. That was it. And I didn't do anything besides ask questions. So yeah, I mean, you can do this anywhere. That was kind of the other reason why I stumbled onto this and wanted to continue pursuing it. because my ultimate goal when I started doing life coaching and got into NLP and then eventually hypnosis and hypnotherapy was I wanted to make an impact. And the idea of only being able to make an impact either by telling a metaphor randomly to a stranger or getting them to see me one-on-one and then having to give them an hour of my time, the impact that I can make is kind of limited, right? So instead, what if I could do it just like, as you said, like I'm standing in line at a restaurant and I'm having just everyday conversation and I notice that they're saying a phrase or a word or something that is weird. So I ask a question about it rather than ignore it like most people would. And I can get them to go into trance just right there. And I could probably help them resolve it in just a couple of minutes, just asking questions. But it seems like I'm just being friendly and just curious. And that's one of the primary principles of Enter the Loop is curiosity. Instead of trying to fix the problem, just be curious about what they're saying, about what you observe, because when you start noticing these things, it's so interesting. People have no clue they're doing it. Like people have no clue that they're, the way that they use their hands or the way that they're using their eyes and the words that they're using at the exact same time. They have no clue that it all means something. But by helping them recognize it, they start going into their own trance because they have to. If each of us, like, was a nominalization, I guess, for the listeners or the viewers, a nominalization, as Mike Mandel and Chris Thompson put it, is a word that's it's a noun, but there's no physical structure. You can't put it in a wheelbarrow. So a wheelbarrow, if it was small enough, you could put it inside another wheelbarrow. You could put a dog in a wheelbarrow, a rocket, given it the wheelbarrow is big enough. But you can't put like love or trust or vulnerability or power in a wheelbarrow. But we can all have these things. So a nominalization is a word that has a different meaning to everybody. Success is probably another one that most of us think about. But we all use them as though they're just everyday words. Like, oh, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, I want to be successful. I want to be able to have I want to be rich and famous. But that's different to everybody, right? To one person, being rich is having a lot of money and being opulent. To another person, being rich might be having a family that loves them and supports them, or being rich is having a good car or something like that, right? So it means something to everybody, but we have to unpack that meaning. That's why David Grove, when he was discussing the idea of using clean language to unpack metaphor, it's the same concept. You're getting them to go inside, so they're focusing their attention internally, and they now have to figure out how to describe something which seems so amorphic, right? Like if like one of the other people that I had on the guest call with Ryan, they described their work, their job as being the old ball and chain, but they kept using this phrase of everything in their life that they expected to unfold in the way that they wanted it to. It wasn't unfolding in that way. So I just linked the two metaphors and I said, how in the world does one person unfold while being chained? And suddenly he went into trance. He had like never thought of that. I connected them, and now I'm seeing him. He's silent for several minutes, and suddenly he goes, "Oh my gosh, they can't!" Boom, right there. It's first epiphany. He's expecting two outcomes. The old ball and chain, but he also wants things to unfold. Can't happen. It's contradictory. So I said, well, what needs to happen so that things can unfold? And he said, I got to get rid of this chain. And I said, what happens when you do that? Suddenly he goes into trance. He must have figured it out metaphorically in his own way. And he sighed and was like, oh, whoa. He goes, I feel so much better. He's like, I don't have this pain in my chest anymore. Like it was just gone. And that was closing the loop. It's not like I'm, again, doing anything besides being curious and asking questions. So yes, you can do this standing at a restaurant looking at a menu.
maybe they'll forget my order and charge me less. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, that'd be funny.
So when did you originally have like this aha moment that, you know what, I can really help people? When did that happen and how did that happen?
Oh gosh, that was probably back in 2014, 2015. I used to be a mobile glass blower. And it started, I went to school, Edward Francis at Tidewater Community College. He had a hot shop up on top of the building. It was actually on the roof. It was really cool. We would blow like glass, literally blow glass, like vases and everything on top of the school. It was really cool.
Well, it
And
sounds like the job blows.
oh yeah, it blew a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of terrible euphemisms with blowing glass. Like one of the ways that you heat up the glass is by using a glory hole. So just look up the terms and you'll be like, wow, okay, that's interesting. But I realized that you could do this, like you can make a mobile glass blowing studio. And I started doing that. At first it was, I just made one at home and just made really cool things and would go to like local venues and sell them at like flea markets and that kind of stuff. But I started realizing that people were asking me questions like, oh, well, how long did this piece take you? And do you have anything you just made? Because they were willing to pay a premium for it. And I was, a college kid is struggling. So I was like, well, why don't I just start doing this live in front of people? So I did. I started blowing glass in front of people live. They would ask questions and they would pay a higher price for the things that weren't just sitting on my table, but for something that I just made because they wanted the thing the artist touched. Like, okay, cool. But I noticed that while I was talking to people, and I've had this throughout my entire life, people would just dump their life story on me, but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't have any formal training, so I would just hear them out. I got really good at listening. This was my entire life. I got really good at listening, whether it was my friends or whether it was even my parents. Like I got really good at that. So I just started doing the same thing. I was curious. I'm trying to get them to buy my stuff, like, buy my crap. Come on, And so they would ask questions and I would just, okay, yeah, blah, blah, blah. And then they would say, wow, that this thing reminds me of like I went to the beach one time with my dad and oh, wow, that's in what beach? And I would just start asking questions about it. And simply by hearing them, simply by listening, they would say, wow, thanks. I feel so much better. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I didn't even have any life coaching, anything under my belt at this point. But at that point, I realized, well, I'm really good at listening. And in the moment I was reading Awaken the Giant Within by Tony Robbins. That book and another book called You Are a Badass by Jen Sincero were like my two introductions to life coaching and understanding that there is power in our language and communication. So in that book, Tony describes how, from Awaken the Giant Within, he describes how people, in all actuality, everybody on the face of the earth, no matter what problem they have, they all just want to be heard. They want to be acknowledged. They want to be understood because most of us go through life without that. We tell someone, oh, I'm struggling in this. And instead of a friend saying, oh man, I hear you, that sucks, they try to relate. Oh yeah, well, that's nothing. Let me tell you about the worst time that happened. And that it doesn't help, right? So now we've built this culture, and my wife is a mental health counselor, so she's part of that. But we've built this culture where it seems like the only people that we can get to listen to us, to really listen to us and our problems, is we have to pay them, which is kind of shitty if you think about it. Like it sucks to think that in order for me to finally feel heard and for someone to listen to my issues, I have to pay them. And then even then, it's like, well, okay, so I'm going to give you some money and hope that you hear me and hope that you figure it out. So when I realized that on the road, if I can just like talk to some people and listen to them, whether it was, I'm selling my thing or even as I'm blowing glass, because I could while I'm shaping things or waiting for the glass to cool down, it takes a couple minutes. So I would ask questions out in the crowd and people would ask and I would listen and people would come up later and say, wow, I don't know, something about just you hearing me out made me feel better. So I think there's something to this. So that was like my first introduction into it. So then I got my life coaching certification, NLP certification, started seeing clients and actually made a difference in their life, even though it felt like in the moment that I didn't know what I was doing because I was still young. And so now it's, almost 10 years into the game. And I've just taken all those frameworks and I realize that, oh, there actually is something to this because our conversation, the words we use, the very precise language we use makes all the difference. It's, it's the difference when you go to the doctor, right? And whether or not it's something terrible, the thing that the doctor tells you could be the end all be all. So if you're getting ready to go to surgery and right before you go in, the doctor says this is going to be easy, like you're gonna feel great afterwards. Don't worry about this. You're gonna feel awesome. That makes us feel better. Like, okay, I feel like I can do this. Versus the doctor that says, hey man, I really hope you make it through this. Like that, it's way different, right? Like even the response is like, oh. So just even that alone is enough to prove that our language is so important. So whether you're seeing clients or just talking to friends or whatever, even my own son, just talking to him in the way that I do, I've trained myself to be very precise with my language because it does matter. And that's that was my epiphany, was way back then. And now here we are.
Nice. Nice. Scott, you got any questions you want to throw out here to Timothy?
Timothy's not ready for me. Timothy, I'm just curious. What was your very first introduction to hypnosis? Your first, just what introduced you to it?
Oh man, that's a great question. Okay. So when I first started my life coaching career, I was struggling, right? And so somebody was like, well, what about NLP? Because my life coaching instructor at the time, Kane Ramsey, he was a Scottish guy, really cool. He taught NLP principles, but he didn't call it NLP. So he taught you about self-actualization and the core life, principle of who you actually are. And then he would add on these like weird techniques like the drop down through method. That's one that NLP knows, where you feel the emotion and then what happens if you drop below that? What do you notice? And what happens if you drop through that, et cetera, et cetera. And then I ended up finding, because I was trying to find people in the local area, and this is in Virginia. I was looking for people who also were life coaches or knew NLP and stuff. And I was just making connections. So go out to lunch with them or, go meet up with people. And there were some people who were really cool. Like there was therapist, like a couple different therapists that were in therapy, were licensed, and then decided that they didn't want to do it. And they moved to life coaching. And then there was this one guy that I bumped into, and I won't give his name, but we'll just call him Jay. And Jay was in a documentary. He served prison time originally in California for embezzlement. And while he was in prison, he did this documentary on finding himself. It was, this lady would come in and she would do hypnosis on the group. And so he started in prison learning about NLP, learning hypnosis. And when he got out, he started training under the Mike Mandel Hypnosis Academy. No BS here. So I meet up with him at lunch, and we're talking about life coaching stuff because he's pretty successful at it, and I'm trying to get some tips on improving myself. And he's like, "Well, it seems like you have general NLP. Why aren't you doing hypnosis?" And I was like, "What do you mean doing hypnosis? What is that?" And he's like, "No, seriously." And he pulls out his laptop and he shows me MMHA. He shows me the Mike Mandel Hypnosis Academy, and he's like, "This guy is awesome. You need to watch his stuff." And he starts telling me how Mike basically changed his life. He started listening to this podcast called the Brain Software Podcast, and him and Chris changed his life. And I was like, okay, no, there's no way that this is going to work or whatever. My son, I think, was like 5. And so I was like, okay. I was listening to the Brain Software Podcast at the airport when I was taking my son back because we would fly together. He was too young for him to do the whole, like, I'm going, on my own. He's old enough now that he can take the flights by himself. And so I was flying with him back to his mom's house, which is in Indiana. And during the Brain Software Podcast, Mike and Chris were talking about power language and like using like because and listening for people's, VAK, whether they're visual, auditory, or kinesthetic, and listening for their language. And so my son he's young, so he kept using words like, "Daddy, look at this," and "Daddy, did you see that?" And I'm like, okay, I think my son's main representational system is visual. So on the plane, he was like super hyper, and he was excited to go back home and all this stuff. And I was like, man, I need some sleep. It was late. And so I just looked at him, I said, "Buddy, I don't know why, but I think I'm going to see you going to sleep soon because," and I gave some whatever. And I said that a couple different times. And he even was like, Daddy, why are you saying that weird phrase? And about 6 minutes later, he falls asleep. No BS. And I was like, okay. So then in that same podcast, Mike and Chris talk about how you can use because and basically get whatever you need. And there was a research study done where I think it was Xerox actually did this, or maybe it was like Harvard. There's a research study done where all these people were lined up to use the printer at, like corporate printer. You got to stand in line, old school. And if someone just said, hey, can I skip ahead? Because, without using the word because of, hey, I need to skip ahead and I've got important papers. Nobody cared. It was like a 4% chance that you'd be able to cut in line. But if you added the word because and then gave a statement before that, like, let me in front of you, because no matter what you said, there was like a 94% chance that you'd be able to get to the front. So I did that during that same flight. I just told people, like, me and my son have to get off the plane because our next flight's coming up. Like, everybody's next flight's coming up if you're flying out, if you're doing a connecting airline, but they let us all through. Even the people in first class, we got all the way to the front when typically we were back, in coach or whatever. And just by saying, my son and I need to get off the plane right now because, and whatever, people let us pass. And I did that almost the entire flight home. And that was my first introduction of actually using language in a different way. And I was like, there's something here. And I even told my wife, who we were just dating at the time, I was like, there's something here. I don't know why, but it worked. And from there, it's just turned into this.
So here's one for us. How do people get in touch with you if they want to get into your program and things like that? We want to put your link up and everything. So tell us.
Yeah, super easy. It's just entertheloop.com. It's all together, entertheloop.com. You can add me as a friend on Facebook. I'm pretty friendly. Just look up Timothy September. If you're in the Mike Mindell Hypnosis Academy or the MMHA Engage community, add me as a friend there. I'm a member there. If you're in any of Ryan M. Montis's groups, I'm in those as well. I would love to hear from you guys. You can also just reach out to Timothy at timothyseptember.com. It's just my personal email. And if you have questions, you can email me there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Now, is there anything you want to add?
Oh man, no, you guys, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on. I guess the only thing that I can add, and it's like the ending benediction, so to speak, is like, no matter who you are, whether you're listening to this or watching the video or, passively or actively, there is something in your life that could change. It could be small, it could be big, it doesn't matter. But ultimately, the only person who's going to change it is you. The only person who's going to come for you is you. And that is also a very, very harsh reality that many people don't realize, is that nobody is coming to save you. The only person who is you. And the more that you wait for something magical to happen to you, the less it's going to happen. You have to be the one to actually do it. And so by making the first step, by showing up for yourself, by learning to love yourself, by learning to accept yourself, and to be happy knowing that where you are today is a direct reflection of the decisions you made in the past, whether or not they were good or bad. The past isn't there to scare you. The past isn't there to be a haunting thing that looms over you. It's simply there to inform you of what to do or not to do now. And so let the life lessons from then carry forward to today. And if you really want to fix any of the major issues in your life, you have to look at Pandora's box. You have to look at it, because the more that you ignore it, the worse it's going to get. And the only person that can do that is you. And so be bold, be brave, and be courageous, and step into the things that seem uncomfortable and unknown. And I promise you, at the end of that, it's going to feel much better when you're 80 or at the end of your life looking back, to go, I'm so thankful that I did that, instead of I regret that I didn't. And I'll leave it at that.
Great words of wisdom. Great words of wisdom.
Nice.
Scott, you got anything you want to throw in here?
Yeah, thank you, Timothy, for taking time out of your busy schedule and being here today.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. This was a lot of fun.
Well, thank you, Timothy. And I'll tell you, we definitely enjoyed driving down your magical psyche highway today. It's been wonderful. Great words of wisdom and got a lot of love for you. And for our viewers out there, hey, if you like us, give us a thumbs up. If you think we're assholes, give us the thumbs down. We don't care. We just want you to respond. We want you to follow us. We want you to join us, and we want you to be part of the community. We hope to see you next week. It's been a blast on the show today. And once again, we'd like to thank Timothy for allowing us to drive down his magical psyche highway. We'll see you next week.
What a great trip it's been.
Wow, what a trip. Thanks for taking that journey with us today. Please like us, share us, and enlighten us with your views of the topics we drove into today. We appreciate you and love reading your comments. Thanks again, and we hope to see you back on the bus next week. That's right.